Betrayed by blood, how patience and strategy turned the tables. You'll never amount to anything, my Uncle Mark sneered as he pocketed what was rightfully mine. I didn't respond, didn't even flinch. But I knew something he didn't. Every move had been carefully planned. The rain came down in torrents, the dark clouds mirroring the heaviness in the air as we stood at Grandma's funeral. But Uncle Mark? He wasn't thinking about her. No, he was inspecting his shiny Italian shoes, his gaze fixed on the water puddling at his feet. He muttered under his breath about how the storm would ruin them. His mother's casket, the woman who had built an empire from nothing, barely seemed to register in his mind. I glanced at him, my stomach turning with a mix of anger and disgust. He looked like a man who'd never done an honest day's work, yet here he was, acting as if the world owed him everything. His flashy suit, his expensive cologne, it was all a mask, a shield to hide the fact that he'd always looked down on me, on everyone. But Grandma had always seen something different in me. She'd often said I reminded her of Grandpa, quiet on the surface, but always thinking 3 steps ahead. Grandma had asked me to speak at her funeral, not him. It was supposed to be a moment of respect, of honoring her life. But Uncle Mark didn't get it. He didn't understand why I'd been the one she trusted with her legacy. The eulogy notes were crumpled in my pocket, the edges damp from my nervous sweat. But I stayed calm. This wasn't just a funeral. This was the beginning of something much bigger. The ceremony dragged on, and I caught Mark glancing at his phone, probably checking stock prices or looking for some new business opportunity. His face remained emotionless, detached as the rain soaked the ground around us. I wanted to say something, anything to make him feel the weight of the moment. But then Grandma's voice echoed in my mind, soft but clear. Sometimes the smartest move is to let others think they're winning. And so I stayed silent, knowing that the real game was just beginning. Days later, we found ourselves gathered at the lawyer's office. The air felt thick with anticipation, and though the room was filled with people, the silence was deafening. Uncle Mark swaggered in late, his presence larger than life. He exuded arrogance as if he were already the king of this castle. His eyes flicked over to me, but he barely acknowledged my existence, a dismissive nod being all the recognition he gave. I could see through the act, though his mind was on the spoils, already envisioning the empire he believed was now his to claim. I, on the other hand, was calm, poised. The many hours I'd spent at Grandma's side in her study, learning every detail of her empire, gave me a quiet strength. I knew something he didn't. I had prepared for this moment, and nothing would throw me off balance now. The lawyer cleared his throat, pulling me back from my thoughts. He began reading through the will, his voice steady but filled with gravity. Uncle Mark leaned forward, eager, his grin widening as the lawyer reached the part about the executor. And then it came. "Mark," the lawyer announced, "you were named the executor of the estate." A wave of nausea washed over me. I kept my face neutral, but inside everything shifted. This couldn't be right. Grandma and I had discussed this at length, had worked together to ensure the future was in capable hands. I had believed she'd left it to me. But there it was, in black and white, Mark had control. I spoke, my voice steady but with a hint of disbelief. This can't be right. Grandma and I had made different arrangements. Mark, sensing victory, leaned back in his chair with a smug grin plastered across his face. "Discussions don't matter without paper, kid," he taunted, his words dripping with condescension. He was right in one sense. On paper, this was his victory. But the game had only just begun. He had no idea what was coming. The lawyer continued, outlining how Mark would have full control over the estate for 5 years before any distributions could be made. Full control. Complete access to everything Grandma had worked for, everything she'd built. I could feel the weight of it all, but I stayed silent. Uncle Mark seemed to bask in his triumph, leaning over to glance at me, his voice laced with superiority. "You'll never understand how business works," he said, barely masking his contempt. I wanted to scream, to confront him about the truth, but Grandma's voice echoed in my mind once more. Sometimes the smartest move is to let others think they're winning. And so I said nothing. But inside I was already 2 steps ahead. I knew what I had, and I knew how to play this game. And Mark? He thought he had one, but he hadn't even realized he was just a pawn in a much bigger plan. Before I share what happened next, the moment that turned everything upside down, let me ask you, my amazing viewers, have you ever had to fight for something that was rightfully yours? Drop a comment below and share your story with me. And if you've ever felt the sting of injustice, hit that like button because this battle is just beginning. As Mark paraded his control over the company, I sat back in the shadows, quietly analyzing the files on the flash drive Grandma had given me. It wasn't just a collection of records, it was her entire blueprint, every move she'd made to build the empire. There were years of financial statements, acquisitions, and a detailed plan for every company under her umbrella. But more than anything, it was her strategy that caught my attention. She had always said, never let anyone see all your cards at once. And that's exactly what I was doing, keeping my cards close, waiting for the right moment. I knew Mark was playing a game of his own, but I could already see the cracks in his strategy. He was acting fast, making rash decisions, firing key employees, and restructuring everything in sight. Every day he sat in the boardroom with his arrogant smirk, thinking he was in control. He took out loans on stable assets, reshuffled departments, and made changes that seemed bold, but to me they screamed of desperation. The more he pushed forward, the more mistakes he made, and I knew every one of them would come back to haunt him. I had a plan of my own, one that would build slowly and quietly, like the foundations of a building no one noticed being constructed. I called Rachel, an old friend from college, and we began discussing a tech startup we'd once dreamed about. It had always been just an idea, something we talked about over late-night coffee. But now, with a small inheritance I'd been saving, it was time to bring it to life. We launched our operation with a quiet, calculated approach, careful not to attract too much attention too soon. Meanwhile, Mark was busy burning bridges. He was so caught up in his ambition that he didn't notice what was happening under his nose. I began acquiring small shares in the companies he was neglecting, the ones he thought weren't worth his time. I hired the employees he'd let go, the ones who were still loyal to the legacy Grandma had built. Little by little, I was building a network of redundancies just as Grandma had taught me. Mark thought he was playing chess, positioning his pieces with bold moves and flashy plays. But I wasn't playing chess. I was playing Go, a game where the true strategy only reveals itself in the endgame. His moves were predictable, and each one only made it easier for me to position myself for the future. Every misstep he took was a step closer to the trap I was setting. I smiled as I watched him make mistake after mistake. He didn't know it yet, but the game was already over. And I was the one who held the winning hand. The cracks in Mark's empire began to show almost imperceptibly at first. As he pushed forward with his restructuring plans, the people who had once supported Grandma's vision were slowly falling away. Key suppliers and long-standing partners, the ones who had helped her build everything from the ground up, started pulling back. They didn't trust him. And why should they? Mark had no respect for the relationships that had kept the business thriving for decades. His focus was on short-term gains, on flashy moves that impressed no one who truly understood the long-term game. I noticed the small, almost invisible pieces of Grandma's legacy slipping through his fingers, the patents, the relationships, the strategic alliances. These were the threads that had held everything together. But under Mark's leadership, they were fraying. And as they began to unravel, I knew it was only a matter of time before the whole empire crumbled. The more he pushed to control everything, the more he alienated the very people who could keep it all intact. And as I watched him dig his own grave, I knew I was ready for the moment when everything would fall into place. I'd been gathering information, quietly building my case. Rachel, along with a few others who had witnessed Mark's mistakes firsthand, had been invaluable. Each conversation, each piece of the puzzle only confirmed what I already suspected. Mark wasn't just mismanaging the business, he was setting it up to fail. His arrogance blinded him to the bigger picture. It was clear he had no idea what he was really doing. The moment I received the call from one of Mark's partners about the loan he had taken out against Grandma's real estate investments, everything clicked into place. It was a massive move, reckless, arrogant, and exactly what I'd been waiting for. Mark had taken out a critical loan using the very assets that had once been the cornerstone of Grandma's success. He thought it was his ticket to controlling everything, but in reality, it was the first step in his downfall. With this new information in hand, I began quietly positioning my assets, moving into place like a predator preparing to strike. Mark thought he was secure in his control, but I could see the foundation beneath him crumbling. And then I found something that changed everything, a forged version of Grandma's will in Mark's hands. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was the last straw. It wasn't just about securing what was rightfully mine anymore. It was about making sure Mark never got away with his lies. I knew I wasn't just holding on to Grandma's legacy, I was securing its future. This was the moment I had been preparing for, and I was ready to expose him. Mark's facade had started to crack, and the truth was about to come out. It all came down to a single meeting, the one I had orchestrated carefully from the very beginning. I could feel the weight of the moment as I stood outside the boardroom, the door slightly ajar, watching as Mark strolled in with his usual swagger. He was oblivious, still wrapped in the arrogance that had led him to believe he was untouchable. This was to be his final act, his grand attempt to defend the empire he had so recklessly manipulated. But today, the table had turned. It was my turn to take the seat at the head of the room. I watched as Mark took his usual spot at the other end of the table, his confidence unshaken, still believing he controlled everything. But little did he know I had already won. The boardroom was silent as I walked to my chair, placing the documents before me one by one. With every passing second, the tension in the room thickened. I could feel their eyes on me, the board members silently wondering why I wasn't starting the meeting as expected. And then I spoke. I began with the smallest piece of evidence, Mark's first lie, a little inconsistency here and there. Piece by piece, I dismantled his defenses. Each lie he had told, every forged document, every shady financial decision he'd made, it was all laid out before him. His once unshakable facade started to crumble. But I wasn't done yet. The room held its breath as I pulled out the ultimate revelation. The original will. The one that marked the true heir to the empire. Not Mark. Me. Signed, sealed, and legal. His face went pale as I placed it in front of the board members, watching as their eyes flicked between the will and Mark, then back to me. Mark tried to explain, tried to talk his way out of the truth, but it was too late. The truth had already been laid bare. I revealed the final blow, the fraudulent loans he had taken out, the forged version of the will he had been using to steal what wasn't his, and the fact that the empire had never been his to control in the first place. The board members were stunned into silence. Their disbelief turned into realization as the full scope of his deceit came crashing down. Mark, desperate, tried to protest, but his words were lost in the wave of evidence I had gathered. His empire, built on lies and manipulation, was crumbling right before his eyes. Every decision, every action he had taken to secure his power had only led him here, his downfall. As Mark's arrogance and greed led to his collapse, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The revenge wasn't about petty vengeance, it was about justice. It was about restoring Grandma's legacy, the legacy she had built from nothing, the one that had always been meant for me. As the meeting came to a close, I knew this was more than just a victory. This was the final checkmate. Mark had underestimated me, and now he was paying the price. The room buzzed with whispers as Mark was escorted out. The board members slowly came to their senses, acknowledging the truth and the future that was now in my hands. Everything he had stolen, everything he had tried to control, it was all slipping away from him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. And as I sat there, the weight of the moment settled in. I had done it. I had taken back what was rightfully mine. But more importantly, I had secured Grandma's legacy. And that in the end was the sweetest revenge of all.